to A Well-Designed Business. My name is Luann Nigara, and I'm so glad you found this podcast. Together with my husband Vince and our partner Bill, we have grown our company Window Works from the ground up. So I know and I understand the challenges you face in running your interior design business. I also know that your talent alone isn't enough to ensure your success. So on this podcast, we talk about strategies and practical steps to help you grow your business. But make no mistake about it, we have our share of fun here too, mixed in with those aha moments that I love so much. This isn't fluff. Nobody has time for that. Whether you are a new interior designer or a seasoned designer, I am here to help you create and to manage the kind of interior design firm that you dream of. It's straight talk and it's action. Are you ready? Let's get started. Hi, welcome to A Well-Designed Business. It's Power Talk Friday. Today, Brad Leavitt of AFT Construction is back on the show with us. I know you're doing your happy dance, right? This is Brad's 5th time on the show. Please look at the show notes today for all the other episodes. And if you've missed any one of them, you're going to want to go back and listen, all right? Because every time Brad comes on the show, he shares advice and ideas that help you better understand and navigate the design build process. And today's show, Brad is going to tell us what it's like from the builder's perspective, right? He's going to explain his timeline and his process so that you can understand how you filter into that and why it's so important for you as the designer to bring your A game, especially when you want to work with better builders, okay? And I have to say, in reflection, I was thinking about it. Over the years, we have sometimes had installers had to sit and answer the phone for a day or a couple of days for whatever the reasons were. And it's always then that I notice that the installer will go back out and do his own job and be much more likely to advise the office of when maybe he is delayed getting to a project or whatever the communication is. Because now all of a sudden he understands what his coworker is going through and how what he's doing in the field is affecting what they're going through. And that's sort of what this conversation is like. It's Brad telling you what the work looks like from his side so that you can see how what you do affects the way he shows up for the client. So I'm excited to share this conversation with you. I think you're going to enjoy it. Hi, Brad. Thanks so much for coming back to A Well-Designed Business today.
Thanks for having me again, Luann.
So, Brad, it's funny. We've spent several podcast interviews together talking about how a designer adds value to you and your process as a luxury builder. We've also talked about how and what you look for in a designer to be that valuable partner in the design build process. And so I encourage everyone listening, if you have missed any of these episodes, to search Brad out in my podcast queue and also look in the show notes for those episodes. And also check out Brad's podcast at AFT Construction. But today, Brad, we are talking and you said to me, Luann, I think it would be really helpful for a designer to have that bird's eye view of what it looks like when I get the first call to engage with a client for a new build, whether that call comes from the architect, that call comes from the homeowner, or that call comes to me through the designer. But I have certain things that I have to do and I have to put in place, and it will probably be helpful for designers to understand what those are, right?
Absolutely. And I want to we'll get into some real specifics here during the course of construction, what I'm looking for the minute we break ground. But I want to speak about what happens in pre-construction because, you know, in many instances, it could be that the client is going to the designer first. They could go to the architect. They could go to the builder. Either way, it starts somewhere, as we know. So I'll just give the example if they come to me, which does happen. So the client will come to me, and I just had a call this morning, so this is good timing. And I'll give the example here in our project because we always talk about that the client and the designer need to meet early on, and designer needs to be involved from the very beginning. Well, what does that mean? So when I get that call from the client and says, okay, Brad, we want you to build our house, and we'll speak through budget and design and aesthetic and style. I mean, lot location. So in our market in Scottsdale, the client will purchase the lot. So they own the land and then they would come to us and we do the build for them. So when they make that phone call, our first process is, okay, we know the lot, let's get the survey done. We get the survey done, we understand the building envelope, because especially when we're building in the natural desert, we can only build, even if the client owns 5 acres, we could probably only build in 1 or 2 acres, right? Because that's the only net area we can disturb. So what's really important is I have to get a surveyor out there. I have to get a company called Tree Relocators, and they designate, these are saguaros, these are mesquites, ocotillos, these are protected, they have to move. So the designer doesn't really have to be involved at that point. And this is going to be the first couple of weeks of due diligence as we're working through the lot. However, once the lot, and we understand we're going to build there, we know the exact specifics, we want the designer involved now. So when we have that first meeting with the architect and they've selected their architect, we want the designer selected. And at that very first appointment, the designer, architect, and myself need to be in that room as we start thinking through the floor plan and exterior elevation.
And so what happens is do you ever get people that say to you, that's too soon. I don't want them involved yet. I want to pick your brain about, I've seen the other houses that you've done, the house on XYZ street I love. I don't want to engage the architect yet or the designer because I still want to have your input at this point. Do you have people that say that to you?
I do, and that's a great question, Lynn, because it's funny. I would say probably about 30% of the clients will say that. They say it may be too early for the designer. I kind of want to think through this, and that's okay. And the way I've handled that is that in a perfect world, we're going to have designer, architect, builder there together as we start designing the floor plan. And at this stage, the architect is really going to drive that process. They're going to really start laying out, okay, how many bedrooms do you need? Do you need offices? Do we have to have, how big's the great room and some of these things. And so they're going to start asking these questions and figure out ceiling heights. And that's okay. But once they have the floor plan figured out, the designer must be involved. And all of the designers that are listening need to make sure that when that floor plan's done, that they are now involved. Because what I ask the architect and the client is that's fine if we don't want to bring on, and I have one case right now where we've worked through floor plan, we've worked through the elevation of the house, and now the designer is going to get integrated now. But we will not move forward to structural, because really what happens is once the architectural plans are done, now we have to get the engineers involved, structural engineer, civil engineer, electrical, mechanical, plumbing. I'm not going to release them until the designer has looked at the plans and said, let's move the toilet, let's move this, let's look at the hallway. Let's configure the office so then that way the desk is here because this is what I'm looking at for furniture, or whatever it may be. And so that's where I want the designer heavily involved, because we need to make sure that the designer has an opportunity to redline the plans before we take the next step.
Okay, so we understand that value, right? You and I, we're rational human beings, and all our designer colleagues listening understand this, right? But we do know that there's resistance. And what I'm curious is there resistance too sometimes on the part of the architect? Like I could almost see a situation where maybe the client is saying, hey, Brad, it's a little early for me to be picking pillows, right? Completely underestimating what the designer's role is in that first red line process, right? It has nothing to do with the pillows. It has everything to do with, like you mentioned in our panel discussion we did recently with Powerhouse Smarts, you said, the designer is often the person that's going to find out that when the bathroom door opens, there's a straight shot of the toilet, which nobody wants, right? So the thing is, when a client is saying, little early for the designer, please, let's put it off a little bit. Do you, in your experience, do architects do the same thing, underestimate the value and the input? Because I got to believe if an architect is not taking into consideration some of the things that the designer knows about the lifestyle and just the different things like the bathroom door swing and blah, 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 he or she is only going to have to go back to the drawing board more often as well, right?
100%. And you are going to see pushback. I mean, that's just a reality of maybe humans and our hard-headed industry, if you will. But, the fact of the matter is, I would say in general, most architects, 70-80% of them are very, they're willing to work with the team. They're willing to be part of that environment, and they're willing to take the designer's input. And I can honestly say, at least here in our market, Phoenix, Scottsdale is a little bit different, where every architect that I work with, they are adamant to have the designer in early, and they ask for
Oh,
that. And they do want them there because, look, they may be passionate about what they're doing and about the architectural design, but they also want that advice from the designer, because the designer has so much to offer from layout and aesthetic, and there's so much more than just the pillow design, as you mentioned, right? As we
mm-hmm.
all understand. But what I'll say is, so in a situation where the designer is bringing in the lead, well, it's a no-brainer. They can direct the client and say, I need to be involved in floor plan because I want to make sure that it fits your lifestyle. And if you have a builder or architect that's resistant, then really what needs to happen is that designer needs to be spending time networking and working with these client or architects and builders through social media or appointments or phone calls. Find any way to get, squeaky wheel gets the grease and get in front of them and help them see the vision. Right? Or tell them to call me, right? We'll have
Tell them listen to your podcast or my
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. We're trying to educate the public, which takes time, because as you get into this, I mean, the designer needs to redline the plans. They need to redline the elevation. And this is where it's really important. I think for any project to be successful, it takes about two months. It's about 8 weeks from when we have a lot and we have the survey done to figure out the floor plan and elevation. And so in my scenario, it's 8 weeks, and then the designer has 1 week to make the red line, send it back. So we're at 9 weeks. Then what happens is the project takes two pass, if you will. So now the architect says, okay, the designer's on board, the builder's on board with the floor plan and the elevation and the architecture. So now we're going to get into the nitty gritty. He's going to sit down with the civil engineer. He's going to get with the structural engineer, the mechanicals, and they're going to start designing all of those mechanical components to the house. Well, simultaneously, what needs to be happened now, we release our designer to say, it's time to design the house, everything. And this is typically a 3 to 4 month process. So, and the designer has 3 to 4 months. Well, the engineers are working on their things. Now they got to get with the client, and this is where it's very extensive. And some designers may have 6 appointments, some may have 4, some may have 8. And this is where they'll start breaking down the overall design. We're going to pick appliances. We're going to pick plumbing fixtures. We're going to lay out your cabinetry, your countertops. We're going to go select slabs. Very heavy lifting from our designers for these 4 months, because now this is really where they're designing the entire house based on that the architecture and floor plan.
So this is what a designer needs to be prepared for. This is what you're explaining. Don't think that we're going to break, we're going to have a contract and then it's loosey-goosey because you're costing me money. So it's a designer needs to manage their own pipeline, right? They needs to manage their internal work, and they have to understand that for you as a builder, that 3 to 4 month period while you're doing all those things, by the time that's done, you expect basically the design book to be delivered, right?
Absolutely. And that's completely on point, Luann, because what happens is that when I sit down with the customer, we're going to tell them that pre-construction is going to be about 10 to 12 months. And the way that's broken down is your first 2 months is going to be architecture and design, or architecture and elevation, as we mentioned. The next 3 to 4 months are design and engineering. So the design is super key. And I will say we're using this time frame is based on maybe a 5,000-6,000 square foot house.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a 10,000, 20,000 square foot house, which we do have some of those, this will probably be a 6, 7, 8 month process for designers. We don't want to shorthand them because, if you're doing a house with 13 bathrooms, it's going to take a little bit more than 4 months. Let's just be realistic. So, but we need to sit down with the designer and say, okay, Luann, if you're designing this house, what is adequate? Do you need 6 months for the design book and CAD drawings and everything? And we need to make sure that they have the capacity and capability, but also the client does, because if the client's local, that's advantageous. If they're out of town, it's difficult, and you're trying to really meet with them and put a lot of information at one meeting. So there is coordination, but our goal is that whatever that time frame is, if it's 3 months, 4 months, or 6 months, when I submit for permit to the city of Scottsdale, I want to have 2 things in my hand. I want to have my design book, and I want to have my complete, they call them CDs, which are contractor drawings, right? Complete drawings. So, and that's, all the mechanicals that we mentioned and the building plan. So if I have the building plans in my design book, I am now set up in a perfect world, 6 or 8 months into the process.
Wow, that's amazing. And that's why when you have your processes well established and you're working within a group of professionals that are also with process driven standards, you can do this. You can all be in concert doing the things that you're supposed to do so that you're arriving there with all of the CDs and the design book at the moment that you need to be, right?
Yeah, and really what it comes down to, and this is where each designer needs to think about their own process and how their company is set up. Because I have some designers, they have 4 months. They can divide and conquer that how they want. And I have some designers that'll say, look, Brad, I'm going to start with the kitchen. That's like the most beautiful part of the house, and we're going to wow the customer. And so they design every aspect of the kitchen. That's, phase one. Then phase two will be the master suite. And then, phase three, maybe the basement, if there's a basement or whatever. And so they'll kind of base it in 6 or 8 sections over the 4 months by room. And then I have other designers that are say, we need to design all the cabinetry first. I want to know the cabinetry. We're going to have fun in the laundry room with, a blue cabinet. And then we're going to do green cabinetry in the guest quarters. And then we're going to do this beautiful white oak in the kitchen. And so they may go with cabinetry first, and then they can start figuring out, okay, now that we have our cabinets, then we'll start going into other finishes and plumbing. And so each designer just needs to understand their system, but just the goal would be the overall timeline to say, okay, let's get all the decisions done in these 3, 4, 6 months, depending on the size of the house.
That's interesting that you said. So what you're saying is some firms, and there's not you're not describing that one is more advantageous. It's just recognizing that firms will do it differently. Some will design a kitchen to completion, lighting, stone, backsplash, cabinetry, all of the things, and then move to another area. And others will take it by component, like all the cabinetry, all the lighting, all the flooring, all the things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, I don't want to interrupt their process, because every designer has their own way of doing things, and that's okay. Now, I want to be involved where needed. I have a lot of designers that'll reach out and say, and this goes back, and this is another important thing that we spoke about when it comes to budget, because as they're working in these 3 to 4 months, we can't lead them astray. We have to give some budget, or target here for the designer. So us as the builder should have already had a preliminary budget based on, so at that 2 months when I have the architecture and the elevation, I need to create a budget. And I should be able to create a budget. It's not going to be exact because there's so many unknowns still for me at that time, but I need to have a budget. And the designers need to be asking their builder for a budget right then before they start, because they need to know, what's my lighting budget? What's my countertop budget? What's my backsplash, right? And cabinetry. And then now within those confines, they can meet with the client and say, okay, we have 50,000 for appliances. As we go to the showroom and we start picking appliances, we need to be within 50,000. And so there's some benchmarks there that they can have. And really, the designers and builders need to be really working together to have those set up so that they can design something that's within budget and not waste these 4 months of design.
And so is that the case, Brad, so it's the case if the client hires you first, that you are working with the client to establish budget. What if the client hires the designer first? Does the designer then, is it their job to establish budget and advise you of it, or is it still always somehow come to you?
And I think this is probably one of the big issues we have in our industry, is that so many customers will go to the designer and go to the architect, and they'll design this beautiful home. And then they'll say, I want to get 3 bids or 4 bids. And they send it out. And now you're getting contractors that are interpreting the design different. They're interpreting the plans. They may build differently. They have different quality of subs. I mean, we could go on and on about this. And so it's really hard to really even know what the price is for the client. And then furthermore, it could come in over budget, where they may say, look, I want to spend $500,000 on my house, and now the design and architecture is done, we're at $800,000. Now I'm not going to do the project. And so it really does a disservice to the client if you can't have that team in the beginning. And so I always recommend to my clients, right, get a builder or designer architect. I think it's advantageous for every designer to push the same thing, to get a builder on board very early, because the reality is, if you have a trusted builder, they're going to bring value. Budget is everything. And if their pricing's fair, then you can actually have a project that's going to be successful. And it doesn't always come down to price. I understand the design for 3 bids, but there's just so many outlying items there that it really should not always come down to price.
No. I mean, and look, the more you are involved in the ideal quality client, the less, not that anybody doesn't track their money and that anybody spends it foolishly, but we all know that once you get to that level, whatever someone says, when there is a reason and it connects with all the things, the trust in you, the trust in the designer, the attraction to whatever the add-on is, somehow the money always is found. I mean, it's just,
It is.
yeah. Well,
No,
because,
and
it's such a permanent thing. It's not like, hey, let me splurge on this dress that I'm going to wear one time and it's 3 times what I normally spend on clothes. It's like, like I always say, are we, what we've design costs 10,000 and what you want is 20,000. So if we don't get it, are we saving 10,000 or are we wasting 10,000? Because you're going to live with this for 10 years, right?
yeah, I love that example. And the reality is, I mean, it's the same conversation we've had before on this podcast where clients will say, I don't need a designer, but what's the value of how you feel in your home, how you're inspired, how how it drives you? I mean, there's value there, notwithstanding all the cost savings we can bring in, but at the end of the day, I mean, budget's important to everybody. And so if they don't have a contractor on board, they can't get a realistic budget. It's unrealistic to ask the designer to come up with the budget on the construction costs when they don't build.
Right.
Just as it's unrealistic to ask me to design a house and I'm not a designer.
Right.
So, getting that team is important because really getting back to the process, the reason why I'm adamant about this and I set that expectation, a timeline with the client is because at the end of these 6, 7, 8 months, as we've done the plans and the design, and I have both of these key items for me, I have my architectural drawings in full detail, and I have my design book, that gets submitted for permit. Now, in the city of Scottsdale, and it varies everywhere, I know California can be even longer, and state of Washington can be longer, but some places quicker. But at least in my demographic, if we're submitting for permit, it's going to take minimum 12 weeks to get that permit back.
Wow.
So, yeah, and so when they submit the plans, it's 12 weeks. And going back to that, before that submittal, here's why it's really key that the designer needs to be involved with their design book, because the designer is going to be doing reflected ceiling plans. They're going to be doing details. They may have coffered ceilings. They may have wood ceilings. They may have whatever it may be, crown molding, different trim. So when you look at the ceilings that they're putting in, or they may be putting in beams, this has to be sent to the architect, because now the architect has to say, okay, we have fire sprinklers, where the fire sprinklers have to go on the box beams and the coffered ceiling. We have to lay out our lighting, right? We have to do all the lighting components. So it's really key that the architect and designer are working together, because that design will impact everything the architect's doing, even as much as appliances. When you go pick the appliances and you're picking whatever brand, and they're built in frameless, there's going to be very specific by the inch where that outlet has to go, where plumbing lines have to be. And so the cabinetry needs to know that, and the architect has to know that. So there's so much, even though they're kind of both taking their own path during those 4 months, there's still a lot of collaboration where they're getting together, sharing CAD drawings and sharing these details and selections, because it will impact the overall permit submittal.
So that's an interesting point to bring up. So we're not all in our own box for those 3 or 4 months. The designer isn't over in his or her corner, you and yours, the architect in theirs. I can see you just expressing the need for probably consistent meetings between architect and designer on updating. Are you needed in that third leg during that period then, or not so much? It's like mostly the communication with those two, the architect and the designer, during that period.
Great question. So I would say every month we're sitting down once a month, designer, architect, and my team. And we're just saying, here's the update. We finalized the appliances. We're doing this waterfall island detail, and we're getting all that to the architect so he can look at that. And he may say, this doesn't impact me, or this does. Let me redline and get this to my, my professional engineer so that they can make the update. So these meetings are taking place, and, right now, Zoom, email. But the minute there's a reflected ceiling plan from the designer, we're sending that to the architect. And even something for like the multi-sliders as we're designing the windows. Out here in Arizona, we have this indoor-outdoor living. We're doing these big multi-sliders. They may want a flush threshold. The designer may say, look, I'm having wood flooring. I want a flush threshold with black granite in the track so it looks nice and clean. And then we're doing our exterior patio tile. So we may have to depress the slab, for that threshold. And so these are structural components, right, that we have to have in the drawing so that I can price it correctly anyways.
Yes, that's interesting. All the little things. It's a gabillion details, like legit.
Yeah, and that's why our clients need designers and architects and builders. But going back to that, and so it's really important because as it's in the city for those 12 weeks in a perfect world, we've taken these steps, and now my team, I sit down with my project coordinator, I sit down with my estimator, my superintendent, and we say, okay, we have our design book, we have our specifications, we have our architectural plans, and it takes us about 2 weeks to really put the scope together. So we have a meeting with the designer, we review the design book, we make sure we didn't miss anything, and then we have all the details. We put together a scope doc, which really itemizes everything. We have awnings, we have, these countertops, full height marble, whatever it is, and then we write everything down on a document. And so then we send this out for bid. So at the end of those 2 weeks while it's in the city for permit, we're sending out our scope doc that we've written, we're sending out the design book, and we're sending out the architectural plans. So now my trim guy, he's not going to miss anything because he could look at the floor plan, then he could look at the designer specs for all the trim and molding profiles, and then he could look at our scope saying there's wainscoting here, there's coffered ceilings here, here's the base and case in the house. And so that way he won't miss anything. And that's really key because it takes our subs about 4 weeks to hard price. So 2 weeks of scope, 4 weeks of pricing. We get that pricing back in 6 weeks. Takes us about a week or two to put together. So 8 weeks in for permit, we have the hard price of the house, and we're about a month from getting that permit. So now we can get with the client, we can finalize the price, make sure they're okay with it, make sure it's close to the budget, hopefully, that we had, set with our architect and designer, and then schedule groundbreaking and moving forward with the construction.
So interesting, because what happens is, and I want to ask a little bit about how you set the guesstimated budget, but at this point what you're saying is about 2 weeks before you get the go-ahead, now is when you have the hard numbers. And this is that place where, with the advice of yourself and the architect and designer, if it's pushed over in a significant way, this is where you peel back, change, do whatever. Is that right?
100%. And this happens very common, especially right now. I'm sure everyone's shaking their head because COVID has really affected pricing. And so, I'll put a price in for lumber and it could go, double in price. And so it's really hard to quantify some of these things. Fuel's up $1 a gallon, which is going to change freight. So, we're doing the best we can, and the designers are doing the best they can. And so there is occasion where, and we just went through this a couple of weeks ago, where we sat down with the client, we had a budget, and it was realistic. The budget was realistic, but the countertop numbers came in about 80 grand over budget. But the reason being is the client was very adamant to the designer, I want to do full slab shower, and they're like, well, that's very expensive, and they have full slabs in the master bath, on the walls, like full walls covered in, slab material.
Wow.
And so it's okay. We sit down with the client and say, do you want to do this? Here's the price. Or do you want to make a red line? And they chose to red line a couple areas. So those 4 weeks where we're kind of in a dead zone waiting for permit, we can make those red lines changes, do some VE, and work with the designer and the client just to really nestle in that total budget.
It's so nice to see and hear what a very strict process that you have. And I love that, you've built in that 4 week space at the end for the back and forth, because it's not like I've got the permits, what's going on? Stop changing your mind. It's like, this is your opportunity. And because we do have to give, some room for that. These are multiple hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars that a consumer is investing. And I think it's valuable for them to have this 4 week period to really sit in the things they want, or to have that, debate / argument with their spouse about what matters and what doesn't, right? Because that's the other thing that happens is one partner has a non-negotiable and another one has a different non-negotiable, but they both drive the budget, right? They both, throw it out of whack.
Yeah, exactly. And the budget is always going to be a sticking point. I mean, it's always tough, even if we lay things out. These are big homes, they're complicated. There's a lot of elements the designer, or not the designer, the client has. Sometimes there's champagne taste and beer budget. And so they're going to drive the designer certain ways, where the designer may try to keep them on track, but they don't want to be on track, right? Because they want what they want. But But the reality is it really comes down to, we're trying to set this up so that all the teams are, we have the same starting point. We have the same expectation. We know timelines, because I know the designers, when they understand that timeline, they're like, Brad, I can work with that. I could do that. I could work with them 4 months, get the design book. That gives me some flexibility. And then we know that at the end, we're going to have 4 weeks where we can still go back and forth and make changes. And that's key, because really for me, I was just on a panel. Clubhouse is something I love, and we kind of got on that app, which is a side note. But I was speaking with a lot of contractors the other day, and one of the questions, we do something called pool plan. And pool plan is PULL. And I've done some YouTube videos on it, but what it entails is, this is a commercial scheduling methodology. And when you're working in a high rise, or you're working in a hotel, or heavy civil, or bridges, some of these really complicated builds, what ends up happening, there's a lot of overlap. And instead of the GC just trying to create the schedule saying, okay, Luann, you need 3 days to come in and do site work, and then we'll bring in the concrete guy and then the waterproofing guy. What really happens is, we sit down in the boardroom at our office, and we bring in all of these companies. They have one representative from each company. We sit down and we go through, what is the time frame you need for this phase of construction? What's your crew size? How many people will be there? And then we figure out the predecessor and successor, which means who's going before you and who's going after you. And so what ends up happening is, so I have this meeting, there's 3 phases of pool plan. So I'll do my first one from when we break ground to when we pour the slab. And if you think about it, if you're building on a mountain or a hillside, it's very complicated, right? We have to have, an excavator come in, and then we have to do retaining walls, and they go in 4-foot lifts, because on a 13-foot retaining wall, you have to do them in 4-foot sections so they can get inspected, and you get rebar and fill with concrete. So there's all these little things. And I know this isn't pertinent to design, but I think it's important, because, as I'm working with all these contractors and I'm sitting in this meeting, they need to know all the specifications. They need to understand what the floor outlets are. They need to understand where all the plumbing is. They need to understand all the valves, right, that we're putting in. And these are important, because as I'm working through this pool plan, I can actually be very targeted now with the commitment from them saying, yeah, Brad, we're going to commit to this manpower, and we're going to have this done in this phase. And so now I can build quicker. And one of the questions, the reason I brought up Clubhouse, because the contractor said, how can you have the pool plan meeting when you don't have specifications and information? And of course, you know me well enough to say, well, that should never be the case. Why are you building a house when you don't have information? Why are you getting to framing and you're waiting on selections? Why am I at frame stage waiting on appliances? I need to know that before I break ground, so that my trades can be effective, so I can be effective. And so my designer doesn't have to have me calling them every single day. Now I can just set up targeted walks to say, okay, designer, we're going to meet at this stage, to do a walkthrough. That way you can, if you want to move outlets, if you want to move lighting, we can do that. But we're prepared, because we know everything that we're up against.
And that is the crux of it right there, that your business runs according to a process, and many contractors and builders and designers just take it as it comes. It's like we're designing the kitchen in real life. Oh, we're standing there and the builder's saying, oh, well, I can't move that beam. All right, well, then we can't move those, you can't make the cabinets that way. So now, you know what I'm saying, right? Like they're doing it on the fly, as opposed to the way your approach is that every professional involved gets all their work done on a timeline.
100%. And we need to be respectful to each other too. Like, I feel like we're doing our designers a disservice as a builder if we're not organized and we don't have systems in place and we don't have a clear schedule. And the reason I bring this up, because look, we are not perfect. I'm going to tell you, there's a couple designers. We've had a few instances as of late where I've had to have some retraining with my team. And one example specifically, we had a home that everything's been designed, and my superintendent called the designer and said, hey, this was a Tuesday. He said, hey, Thursday, we're meeting with the client. We're going to do a walkthrough on the cabinetry and the lighting. And the designer couldn't be there. And so, because it's short notice, and this is where it's our fault, we need to make sure that we're giving the designer a few weeks. We've known about this for months. Why are we calling 2 days before? And now the client didn't have, or the designer didn't have opportunity to show up. And now the designer looks bad because we're doing a walk without the designer that should be there. And then the client's frustrated because the designer needs to make some decisions on just a couple things. And this is where I was frustrated with my team, because we also have to be prepared. As you mentioned, we already have the plan. We know this. We need to make sure we're given the right lead time so that our designers can be there.
Because in that moment, if there are questions that your team is asking the homeowner is thinking, I need the security of my designer to answer these, right?
Yeah, and they don't know. They have this blank look in their face because they're like, I don't know. Like,
Right.
where's my designer? And
Right.
that's why, as much as the design books are key, there's still interpretation on some things, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why we do have to involve the designer and give them the courtesy, not only of time frame but also respect at the walk. I mean, we should not be dominating the walk when the designer comes in and is giving their opinion on certain things. We should not be dominating that because that's not our position to do so.
Well, and that is one of the pet peeves that designers do have is that when they're in a walk with the contractor and the client and there's a question that comes up of an either or how to, when the contractor will step in and start to give their opinion. And it's one thing if the opinion is needed from a structural, technical thing, but I mean, I've watched, builders sit there and say, well, I think the fireplace should end here and it should start there and the thing. And you're just looking at them like, buddy, like, know your lane. And there's the designer going, no, because you see, we're going to add some molding here and you don't know. But see, oh, you know what I just heard myself say? We're going to do this and you don't know it. That's when the design build book isn't done ahead of time, right? So there's a situation where the builder is just overly sharing and overly thinking his or her opinion matters. But then there's when the whole design hasn't been pre-scoped and everybody is all making it up on the fly. And therefore you do have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, right?
Yeah, and I think this is always a tough one to navigate because you're always going to have those builders that are super opinionated, super dominant, and I know it's very frustrating for anyone listening. But to your point, Luann, I think there's some ways around that because what you don't want to happen, you don't want to be in a position where you and the client and the builder are sitting there as a designer, and you're trying to decide a fireplace detail or a mantle detail or a countertop return. In a perfect world, the designer has already done that in their design book, or maybe they call the builder offline and say, hey, look, let's meet at the house. I'm going to be meeting with the client in an hour. Let's meet an hour before. Here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about doing this mantle, this fireplace surround, and here's the return. And then the builder who maybe has this huge ego that's wanting to dictate it and give his opinion, at least now they can kind of work through it to say, well, maybe you're not thinking of this, or maybe he's just ego driven, and the designer can soften it up and already come to a solution. So that way, when the client comes, you're not doing it in front of the client.
Right, right. So good, so good. Now, one of the things I just want to go back to is how, like you said, that there is a budget that is sort of put out there, but it is several months until the hard budget is actually established. How is that original budget arrived at if the design hasn't been done yet? Like, how does that happen? Whose responsibility is that to happen? Because what I've heard is, when like a builder will come in and but I think Jenny just said it the other day when we were at the Powerhouse Smart. She said, or was it you that
It was Jenny. Yeah.
yeah, right. Jenny will say that a builder will come in and yes, it does include all the plumbing that physically needs to happen in a house. And it does include tile, but it doesn't include anything at the level that the ultimate design will be. And so what happens is you've got one builder that is coming in, I don't know what to say, bare bones, but certainly not. Is it just a matter of recognizing like that the builder has a certain level of aesthetic and luxury as well? Like, how do you do that?
Now that's a great question, Lamb, because there's a few things here. Yes, the designers need to align themselves with builders that at least have a good pulse and aren't trying to underbid the project, because what happens is when they're giving very low allowances to the client, it does a huge disservice to the client and to the designer. Now, in our case, we're always going to try to vet the clients that fit what we want to do, but that's not always going to take place. And so we do have to be conservative. However, the way that's broken up is there's two sections, right? So when we have the floor plan and elevation designed, I spend time with my architect together, and we know the lot condition, we know the site conditions, and we know the plan. So even though I don't have all my structural engineering and the soils report and all these little things that can impact it, I have a good basis to say, yeah, we're going to have to raise the building pad, 5 feet. So that's going to cost X dollars. So I can start putting together, okay, it's a 5,000 square foot house. On average, we're at, let's just say $40 a square foot for lumber, for material and install. So that's 200 grand, right? And so I can, based on historical data, go through and start penciling in some numbers for masonry and concrete and framing and roofing and drywall. Now, with the finishes, I prefer to sit down with the client and the designer, or one or the other, and understand, okay, is this house going to be all wood flooring? Yeah, we want wood flooring. We don't want carpet. Okay, it's 5,000 square feet. We're going to put in a budget of $12 a square foot for labor and material. We're at 60 grand for wood flooring, right? So now I can put in that budget of 60 grand, and then the designer will come to me and say, okay, you gave me, where are you getting this number from, right? Where's this $12 a square foot? And I could tell them, well, my installer is going to charge $350 a square foot for the glue and the product they have to use and the labor, which gives you $850 a foot for material at their cost. So now they have a really good number to say, okay, let's go pick the flooring we want, wide plank wood flooring, and here we found this at $8, so we're within budget. And so that's where it's key to really get the best pulse you can, just asking the client. And most designers will have some sort of questionnaire or pictures or Pinterest or house to get a good idea of what the client wants. So then that way we can actually give them a realistic budget based on their taste and not just underbid them.
And so the thing is, I guess what I'm saying is, you are like the unicorn of builders, Brad, right? Like, come on.
No, well, it's funny. Well, here's the thing. I mean, I feel like there's a lot more builders that are going down this road. They're not all there. It's funny you bring up Jenny, because Jenny, and there's a few other designers that listen to your podcast, and we talk about this all the time, that I have some competitors to this day that continue going and lowball because they want to get the job from me. And it's tough, because when Jenny or some of these other designers are on those projects and they're saying, you're giving me $4 a square foot for wood flooring, what do you want me to do with that?
Right.
And that is always going to be, but I found that if we could get the ear of the customer, if the architect can get the ear, the designer and the builder all together and say, look, this is realistic, this is what it's going to be, then it's not just one person trying to convince them. You have three, and a lot of them will listen to that.
I think what we're saying is, it seems like it's so funny. Business owners that select the word of the year for them, right? And it's just what I keep hearing over and over and over and over again is relationships. It's what you're saying is, we know that situation where the builder is going to lowball it. And if you are an educated designer, and I don't mean, schooling, I mean experience with, as you said, data, Jenny can look and say to a potential client, okay, I get that this builder is that much less expensive, and I appreciate that, you don't want to spend the most money that you possibly can, but let me point out that he or she has allowed $4 a square foot on wood flooring. This isn't even realistic. He or she has allowed X amount of dollars for lighting, and this is why this isn't realistic. You see, as a consumer, if you can show it to me, I might say to you, well, why? What is flooring? What should it be? And if she says to me, it's $8, I might say, well, show me a $4 floor and show me an $8 floor. And she would probably say, why don't you show me the floor you want and I'll tell you what it would cost. And then she'll say, that one's $12. I'd be like, oh, great. So 4 is stupid. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And so the idea is that we're all, as designers, they're all going to run into that builder contractor that is going to always lowball. But the more educated they are on what construction costs are and products costs are, the more they can say, I hear you, but this isn't really going to be what it cost. Or you're going to have to go with carpet in the whole house. Are you going to live with that? Right? I want to know that as a consumer, and I would feel so that my designer was worth every penny if that was the type of decisions that the designer helped me make at the beginning and the type of problems that I would avoid, halfway through construction because of those conversations on the beginning, right?
Yeah, I love that you share that, Luann, because really what it comes down to is collaboration. So I know, for example, like with Jenny, there's some clients. So there's a part of town here in the greater Phoenix area where it's a little bit more budget sensitive. Maybe the comps aren't there, when you look at comps for real estate, appraisals, whatever, this all plays an impact in it. But What's nice is Jenny can go to the client and say, look, I already know these builders. This one's going to lowball you, but Brad's price will be higher from the beginning, but it's right. You're not going to be change order. It's going to be realistic. And so what I found is that as I collaborate with designers and architects in my market is I use the term in marketing silent salesman, right? And really what that means is people that sell your brand that aren't on your payroll. So any company that wants to be successful needs silent salesmen. I mean, based on the apparel we wear, the clothing or things we buy, we're selling brands, we're selling things all the time. So what I want to do is say, okay, I've worked with these designers. They know my process. They know I'm going to take care of them. They know I'm not going to belittle them. And so they know that I'm going to give a realistic budget to them and create an environment where they could be successful. And so now if they're involved in the beginning or they're speaking with the client and I'm not there, they can share that ethos, right? That mentality that we have. And so that's where that collaboration is, as the designers listening start building those relationships with their architects and builders, they can do this with the client. And the reality is you may only have 25% of your clients that get it and say, okay, I'm willing to do it. And you have 75% that are going to be hard-headed and just are stuck on price without understanding that the price given is not going to be the price that they pay at the end of the day.
That is probably the most critical point to make to the consumer is, and you know what I always say, the line I love, in my experience, like I love that line because it says it all. It's like I can imagine any one particular designer, as we're talking about Jenny, and of course, Kat Anderson, we know also has this level of expertise with the different builders that are in her area. For one of them to say, in my experience, the product, even if this is true, the product for both this builder and this builder will both be beautiful. They both, you've seen it because somebody's probably getting the quote from one builder because they've seen the work, right? So in my experience, the product, the outcome, the result will be beautiful with either of these firms. But this builder will typically, when we finally get to our hard number, is going to be 25 or 40% higher than what we get as a price now. And this builder is probably going to be within 5 to 10% of the price that we get now, right? I mean, that's a legitimate thing to understand and know.
Yeah, and it really just comes down to that confidence. As you say, as you have experience and you could speak from my experience and you could speak with confidence, customers will get it. It's funny, we're doing a project with Shay, from Studio McGee, and she's the same, like, someone who's very, versed in her brain and what she's doing, and she could sit in front of the client and just tell them with confidence, no, this is what the furniture budget's going to be. This is what the decor allowance needs to be. This is what, the budget needs to be for construction as we work with Brad and AFT. And so together, from our experience, which we have plenty of now, we can direct that to the client. And so, and Jenny's done the same thing. And so this is where it's really important to have that experience and understand. And, and as you speak with confidence, some clients will get it and they'll take that experience to heart.
I love it. I love it. And that's pretty cool, doing a project with Shay and her crew. That's fun. Is this your first build with them, or have you done others?
This is our first build with Shay. It's going to be an amazing home. It's actually a repeat client of ours that we built for in the past. That I can't say who the client is now, but we will release that at some point. But a very well-known client, and just an awesome ambassador. He's been, in fact, I always use the tagline, "Saving marriages one house at a time," and he actually came up with that, which is kind of funny. But great friend of mine, and Shay's going to be coming in, so it's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be her first one with us here in Arizona.
Oh, that's interesting. That's so cool. So it's your client, your project, and your client requested and wanted to have Shay be the designer, or did you suggest her?
Yeah, it was kind of a small world. The client knew her as well, and known me, and so there's a collaboration. And so it's kind of there were kind of a few things that kind of pulled together to make it happen. But yeah, it'll be fun. And we have some really fun projects coming up. But what's interesting, it's funny, going back to the experience and confidence, one example that helped me kind of set the course for my company. This is early on in my career. I think I was maybe a year out of college, and I was working on this amazing resort, the hotel resort here in Paradise Valley, this beautiful project. I'm this young whippersnapper, whatever, trying to, do what I need to do. And the designer, her name was Beth McGeehee. She's a local designer here in Scottsdale and does some amazing work. And she is just extremely knowledgeable, very experienced. And I was in there with one of the trades, and we were going through the fireplace detail, and I deviated from the plans. I made a decision myself in the field, And she came out and she let me have it, and she gave me
Whoa.
some what for. Yeah. And it was funny. And it was the first time. And she's like, Brad, you have no authority to make this decision. This is not your scope of work. And it was very direct, but she was very kind the way she did it. And it really changed the course that I realized I shouldn't be making these decisions. I'm the builder. I just need to execute the designer's vision. And we just had an experience a couple weeks ago where, we had our design book, we had our architectural plans, and now we're installing the tile in the shower, and the shower glass was installed. And my superintendent made a decision on his own on where he should line up the shower glass with the tile. And he didn't call the designer and definitely didn't call the client. And so they were frustrated, and I had to have a team meeting, do our little autopsy here real quick and let them know that, hey, we have no decision to make on any project. It's our responsibility that if there's a question or things don't line up or not designed to field conditions, that's okay. We call a timeout. We call the designer. We get a solution. We go to the client. And so it's really important that the designers also educate their builders. Just as we mentioned, meet before the client's there. Let the builder know, hey, there may be some things on paper that look great, but when it comes to execution, it may not work. But call me. Pick up the phone and call me so that we can work through this and solve this before the client's involved. And needless to say, we had some costs in fixing the shower and redoing the glass, and that's okay. The fact of the matter is we should not have made that decision on our own. So, it all comes down to communication, collaboration.
Right. Well, and the particular employee on your team that made that call, he won't do that again.
No, he will not.
No, you know what I mean? Because he I'm sure he's a professional. He wants to do what's right. He thought he was doing what was right. But once you have all of those costs involved and stuff, and it just recognizes that. And I always say, what, there's some mistakes you make over and over again, and there's some mistakes you make once because, all the things are involved, the emotion, the loss of, pride, the money, all the things. And it's like, yeah, that was a painful one. Let me remember that one, right? So,
and I'm okay with him learning that because like you said, Luann, he's not going to make that mistake again. And the reality is that it does happen. I mean, I made that same mistake early in my career. And really, I feel, that this has really set the course for who we are today. And things have to happen that way, and that's okay.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's so true. And it's interesting as you grow your team and you try to impart to your team your standards and your values. They do make mistakes. And it's funny because I just said at a sales meeting, three salespeople working for us now at WindowWorks, and I was explaining the way I thought that a proposal should be written. And I could see a little bit like, really? Is that quite necessary? You know what I mean? And I literally just said, look, do you know why I do it this way? I said, because there was a time when I didn't, and it bit me in the booty. This is the way you do it so that it brings up the question before you take the money, right? You're calling out. So it's based on, in my experience, this will get us to a better result. So
absolutely. My experience, that's the best way to lead with it. And really, I mean, that's, for any designer listening, I mean, this is really the schedule that we have. We want to figure out as much as we can in pre-construction. We want to be able to do our pool plan meetings and then give timelines to our designers. So, because there are target walks, of course, before we do electrical, what we do is we box the house and we'll put up all the switch boxes and the outlet boxes, and then we'll label on the floor where all the can lights go. And we don't wire it, but we bring the designers to and the clients. So if we move boxes, there's no cost, right? Because we haven't wired anything. If we need to move lights, if we've changed from 4 beams to 6 beams, which sometimes happens, we know changes happen, we can lay out the lighting, maybe we're doing automation. Where do we want the iPad or the panels, for the control system? And so, if we're having backsplashes, decorative backsplashes, we don't want to put an outlet in there. We want to do a plug mold. And so these are really key that we have these walks. And so our goal is that the designer can work really heavy lifting in the beginning, get the design book done. And then that way through the course of construction, it's dealing with changes and scheduled walks.
Love it. I love it. There's so much that goes into it. Really, it's mind-boggling to think that between the 3 of you involved, an architect, a designer, and a builder, and then add the landscape architect to that, little party of 4 now make it. It's the details are incredible. And it's nice that we have this opportunity to express all this so that each of the trades understand all the things on the plates of the other partners in this collaboration. So, you know what, Brad? I love when you come to the show. I think you always help us in some way, some shape or form, help designers think about their business in a more intentional way so that they can come to the process, to that relationship, to that collaboration as a stronger player and a stronger partner in all of that. So thanks tons, Brad.
Well, Luann, you're the best. Thank you. And I'm glad your listener had the question of how can they deal with those tough contractors, being thrown under the bus that are super opinionated. So again, just lasting advice if you can, and you have a difficult contractor, just try to meet beforehand when the client's not there. And I think that'll help solve some of that. So thanks for having me.
Love it. This entire thing reminds me of the hip bone is connected to the knee bone, and the knee bone is connected to the ankle bone, and all the things, right? It's like you are the four legs of a table: the architect, the builder, the designer, and the landscape architect. Each one of you has so much pressure to do what you do, but each one of you are so affected by the others and how the others of you show up. So when you are doing your best, then you are a reliable partner in the process. And then when you are a reliable partner in the process, and a builder and an architect and a landscape architect can come to know that to be true about you, then you're the one that gets the referrals, right? Because if they know that you are going to do what you say you are going to do on time and in a way that makes their life easy, they want you on the job, right? So when they have an opportunity to say to a homeowner, hey, this is a designer you can rely on, like Brad. Brad wants to work with designers that he knows are going to deliver a good process, because at the end of the day, it makes his job easier. It makes him look even better to his client. And he told you it saves him time. And when it saves him time, it makes him money. So that is how everybody's always saying, how do I work with the builders? How do I find the builders? How do I get them to refer me? How do I get them? This is how. Show up, be organized, deliver a good product, be somebody that they can count on. And it's the same. It goes right straight through to the architect and landscape architect as well. When you become known in the community as somebody that is a reliable partner, as I said, then you will get the referrals. Right? And to this end, we have Design Build 101 and 201 in Lou University starting next week, especially if you're listening to this in real time. The semester is starting March 15th, 2021. And if you want to get those referrals and you want to work with builders like Brad, then you want to learn how to deliver your design build book in an organized way. Jenny Slingerland, who Brad mentioned, she teaches the 101, Design Build 101. And Kat Anderson, who was on the show a few weeks ago, she teaches 201. All right. Go over to luannuniversity.com to get all of the details. It's not too late. If you're listening in real time, it's not too late to get in on the class. And then maybe you could be on your way to really learning and understanding how to deliver that product so that you are part of that awesome team that does those kinds of projects that you can be really proud of. All right. My great thanks to Brad for coming back to us today. Keep in mind, you don't have to wait months to wait and learn to hear from Brad again, because you can subscribe to his podcast too. AFT Construction Podcast. Tons of terrific information for you there as well. And that's also a very special opportunity to listen to the conversations of the builders, so you really can see and understand the pain points they have, and then help figure out a way to be the answer to their prayers, right? So I have to say thank you tons for listening today. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you are still taking some advice from last Friday's podcast and giving yourself some grace and really doing the things that you know you can do when you can do them, not giving yourself so much slack that you're not showing up as your best, but giving you enough slack that your best is all that you have to do each day. Okay? All right. Decide to be excellent. Thank you so much for joining me again today. This podcast is a production of WindowWorks, your resource for custom window treatments and awnings. To learn how we can help you on your next interior design project, go to www.windowworks-nj.com. And if you're interested in working with me on your business, either through masterminds or one-on-one coaching, or you want to know how to get my book, The Making of a Well-Designed Business, or you just want to know what's going on in the podcast land and where I'm going to be, all of that is found at luannigara.com. Thank you so much. Have an excellent day.